Thanks for all coming into the littler room, which we can now do more seats by the looks of it, but thanks for all coming upstairs. There should be lots of good content up here throughout the day, and obviously there'll be plenty downstairs too. Anyway, to start with, we've got David Perdomo and Daniel Girela here. They've done some work on how to break down a set defence with Mark Thompson and James Goldring, who have chickened out presenting, but that's fine. David is a Colombian mathematician. He obtained his undergrad from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, where he also undertook a research master's and held a teaching position for 2 years. He then moved to the UK in 2015 and studied an MSc in sports management and the business of football from Birkbeck University, and he's been a data scientist at 23 Sports since 2017. Daniel is a Spanish mathematician. He obtained his undergrad from the Universidad de Málaga and his PhD from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Okay, yeah. After working in financial consulting and the gambling industry in Madrid for a number of years, he recently joined the data science team at 23, fulfilling his desire to merge his background in mathematics and his passion for football. He's an avid Real Madrid fan, but we won't hold that against him.
And Javi Fernandez is in the other room.
Okay, so they're going to talk about how to break down a set defense.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So, we're going to give you a talk titled How to Break Down a Set Defense. It's a project we did within the data science team at 23 Sport. We did it exclusively for this event, hoping that it's something very applied and tactical and interesting for the audience. It was a bit of a blank canvas when we approached it, so nothing really to go off of. So we're going to show you end-to-end what we did with starting with this question and not having much more to go off of. This is the team involved, so David Perdomo, Meza, myself, and Daniel, who's on stage with me, Mark Thompson and Jamie Goldring, who chickened out, apparently, who are in the audience and you can catch up with later. Right. So let's begin with the actual question, how to break down a set defense. So this is a very interesting question, clearly. Very important in football. Teams will find themselves against a set defense quite often in which their opponent has transitioned back into their set defensive shape and they need to break them down in some sort of way. There hasn't been much work done on this that we know of. So what are the challenges of actually dealing with this question? So first of all, there's no actual labels in the data that tell you that you're actually up against a set defense, right? No data feed is going to have such a label there. So, it's a subjective concept that you have to figure out by yourself. Event data isn't tracking data, naturally. So with tracking data, you could try to do something about the position of the defenders and how far back the pitch they are and where they are shape-wise, and that seems like it should be easy, but with event data, that's clearly not the case. And event data is heavily biased towards attacking events, quite clearly, right? So we have to flip the question on its head and say, what in the events of the attacking team indicate that they might be attacking against a set defense or a defense that is set? And ultimately what we have to do is define a proxy there to really be able to just think about the situation. That's the first part of the talk that we're gonna show, defining that proxy. And then ultimately what we really care about then is once we have that proxy, what are the factors associated to the success or failures of these game situations? So Daniel is going to talk about the actual proxying stage.
Thank you. So the first thing that we're going to do is to filter out some possessions that we are not interested in because we believe that they don't reflect that situation of attack against asset defense. And so I want you to keep in your mind these 4 words: duration, pinballing, height, and verticality, all right? Because these are the threshold, the conditions in which we are going to impose thresholds for every event to be potentially in an attack against asset defense. So I want to mention that we only do this for possessions that are attacking, in the sense that the attacking team reaches the final third, and we remove set piece possessions because we think that mostly they are going to introduce noise in this style. All right, so in terms of duration, as in how long the attacking team have hold the ball for, we are going to impose a criterion on duration because we want to let the defensive team finish their defensive transition and be able to get in the shape that they want. So in order to decide which is the right threshold for this, what we look is at what's for possessions that have length less than X, what are the goal scoring odds, and we notice that after 20 seconds this plateaus, right? So what this means is that if you let time flow after 20 seconds, basically your odds of scoring a goal don't increase, so we believe this is an indicator of the defense being set. Also, in terms of pinballing, in the initial study of possession that we do, we are filtering out possessions in which the attacking team does less than 80% of the actions on the ball. So, half clearances or miscontrols of the defending team, if they take more than 20% of the time, we disregard this possession as we deem this to be pinballing, and we also impose these conditions event by event. So for every event, in the last 20 seconds, this 80% of on-ball events done by the attacking teams needs to be satisfied. We also want to impose a condition on height, because event by event, we want to see that in the possession there's an intention of attacking. So for every event, we are going to look on a 3-event average of how far from their own goal the team were, and to decide which is the right threshold for this condition, we basically look at what's the location of center backs when they are making their passes. So we take that 43-meter threshold, which is roughly the 60th percentile of this distribution, because we believe that when the ball is further from your own goal, that distance, that implies that there's an indication of the team being in intention of attacking. And finally, we impose a condition on verticality. We want to disregard full-blown attacks against a defense that potentially is not set. We want to disregard situation in which the defense opens itself and lets the team move forward by some sort of error. So we want to impose a certain condition on the vertical velocity of the attacking team, so that if it's too high, it indicates one of those conditions that I just mentioned. And to define which is the right threshold for this, we basically look at counter-attack possessions versus regular play possessions, and what's the distribution of vertical speed for those, and that's how we determine that this 4.3, roughly, meters per second threshold is the right one. So to sum up, in attacking possessions, we are only going to consider events that are at least 20 seconds into the possession, such that in the last 20 seconds there's not been a lot of pinballing, and that such that the height and the verticality conditions mentioned in there are satisfied. If all those 4 conditions are satisfied at the same time, we consider the event to be true, as in an attack against a set defense situation. So I guess that there were a lot of numbers in there, that there's possibly too many concepts, so we are going to show you a video where we can illustrate how this is holding up. So this is Liverpool possession against Crystal Palace last season, so there's a timer in there, so the first 20 seconds of the possession are basically for build-up. This came from a throw-in, so the defensive team is more or less set in the beginning, but potentially they could be pressing up and not letting Liverpool move forward. So you'll see now that there are some events tagged as lack of height or verticality, so it means that something's happened in the surroundings of those events that doesn't let all conditions to be satisfied, and now the defense is set. There's now this vertical pass to Mo Salah that tries to open a line somehow, but nothing really gets out of it, so they go back to this probing default state, which carries on a little bit more. And in a bit, the ball is going to get back to Robertson again, who's going to try to dribble and accelerate the action. And since there being a little time of control of the ball for Crystal Palace, in a bit, the algorithm detects that there's been some pinballing. So our study divides events in terms of being true or false for certain conditions, and so David is going to talk now about those.
Okay. Thank you. So as you saw in the video, a move consists of true events and then false events. When you reach a true event, we kind of recognize that something has happened, and we proxy it as the defense being set. And then there are false events interspersed with those. So you saw an event in which Mo Salah took the ball with his back to goal. It was a bit of a vertical pass, and it immediately marks that as false, but then he plays it back, and then it continues to be true, right? So I think the takeaway there is that we don't only care about true events, we care about false events within these moves as well. And right now what we're going to do is look at all these moves that contain true events, false events, and try to understand how the interplay of the features of the true events and the false events relate to reward and risk, right? So what is the potential reward of a move? Well, maybe you manage to score a goal. What is the risk? Maybe you lose the ball and you end up conceding a goal of your own. So we want to understand how these moves and their true states and their false states relate with the reward and the risk associated with them. So I'm going to begin with the true events. And I'm going to begin by something that we call empirical expected threat, which is aimed at understanding how the location on the pitch is associated with the level of threat for the true event. So this is clearly motivated by Karun Singh in the audience, his work on expected threat. He's going to give a talk on this later, so I'm not going to spoil it. But basically, the basic setup that Karun does is that he establishes a recursive formula for each location on the pitch that converges after 5 or 6 iterations and tries to assess the level of threat associated with each location. And the intuitive interpretation of that is that it suffices to know whether you're going to score a goal from a location within the next 5 or 6 moves to really assess the level of threat associated with that location. So we've gone the empirical route of this. What is the empirical likelihood of scoring within the next 5 moves for each given location? It's a very rough frequencies approach, but it has one major advantage, let's say, to the full-blown kind of theory that Karun is going to present, and it's that we can compute it for any subset of events, regardless of whether the actual outcome is in that subset of events or not. Right? So we could compute it just for the true events, and it doesn't matter if they then went through a false state and that led to a shot. We can just compute this for that subset of event that we're currently interested in. So this is the comparison of empirical expected threat from every location on the attacking half of the pitch. Below that was just noise when events are marked as occurring against set defense versus events that are marked as coming from counters on the left and events that are false on the right in other possessions. So we can see that around the halfway line, locations are much more dangerous. It's much more threatening to be in a location near the halfway line when you're playing a counter than when you're playing against set defense. You know, it's obvious, intuitive that you're going to have space to attack into. But that starts to diminish as you get towards the byline, right? And the same can be said of the false case, that there's a relative disadvantage of attacking against set defense further yard up the pitch, and that starts to diminish towards the byline. So when we look at what it actually is about the byline, let's say that the closer you get to goal in these attacks against set defense, we notice this, which is quite interesting, which this shows how passes into the 6-yard box are coming disproportionately more from the byline when you're attacking against the set defense than when you're not. And I think cutbacks are, in football, or it's well understood that they are dangerous and it's a crucial route to goal. So the fact that disproportionately that's the route to goal that occurs the more often is explaining why that starts to diminish towards the byline. So that's quite interesting, and I think probably the best example of a team that exemplifies this is Manchester City. We know that they play that strategy of getting to the byline and playing a cutback that then leads to a goal-scoring opportunity. This is the difference between their empirical expected threat against the set defense compared to the rest of the teams. And we could see that in the box and in the byline, they tend to be more dangerous. And then when we look at how they get to the byline actually in these situations, we see this half-space idea that they use to play into that space. So up to this stage, we've talked about location and how location relates to threat, but location is a bit of a funny one because it's quite obvious, right? The further you're up the pitch, the more likely you are that you're going to score within the next 5 moves, and everybody's already trying to do that to break down a set defense, move further up the pitch. So let's see if we can look at some other features and how they relate to the likelihood that we're going to score soon when we're against set defense. So we've been talking about distance to goal related to location, so that's a clear one. A unique feature of StatsBomb data is whether an event was performed under pressure or not, and clearly that should have an effect on the likelihood that you'll score within the next 5 events as well. The rolling speed, so how quickly are you moving the ball in the lead up to an event. Rolling width, how much of the pitch are you covering on the wide axis, and the rolling time between consecutive passes. So we're going to look at these features of true events, and we're going to see how they relate to the success of a move. So how they relate to the likelihood that you're going to score, the likelihood that you're going to score within the next 5 moves. This is quite a hard problem, right? So it's an unbalanced problem, obviously. The sample is very unbalanced. You don't have many events marked with a goal within the next 5 moves. The regressors are probably not independent. And there's not going to be a nice linear decision function that we could do with like a logistic regression of types, right? So it's going to need complex machinery. What we did was we fit a gradient boosting machine to this using the XGBoost package, and it performed well. I'm not going to talk about the validation of how we know that it performed well, but this slide shows that in a test sample, the probability that it gave to events that actually led to a goal within the next 5 moves is the blue one, and it's heavily skewed towards higher probabilities compared to the events that are marked as false. So the model's performing well. What's the problem though with a gradient boosting machine? That we want insight on these features, and a gradient boosting machine is a big black box that we can't really pull apart and understand how each feature is relating to success. So I'll offer a fair warning that I'm going to give the explanation of the technique that we tried to extract some insight here, but it might not be, it might be a bit too technical. So bear with me for a couple of slides, and we'll return to the results soon. So suppose that you have a sample like this. So you have a cloud point, and you're going to build a gradient boosting machine on it, or any type of, let's say, regression tree, any type of black box that you're going to build that is going to predict the likelihood of something on the sample size. So the problem with these things is that they tend to learn very locally. They don't learn globally like a logistic regression where you could just fit in the features and get a prediction. So we want to make use of that locality. So what we're going to do is we're going to cluster the sample, and we're going to hope that within each cluster there's a bit more structure, and we can understand maybe how it's making predictions within each cluster. So we're going to fix the centroid of each cluster, and then we're going to look for predictions over these lines right here. Okay? So we're going to vary over the crosses, and in each point of the cross we're going to make a prediction, and we're going to see how the prediction is evolving with the varying of the features within each cluster. This is something that we tried to kind of pull this apart and see if we could get something. So this is the result of the exercise. We're going to zoom in a second, and don't worry, we'll actually talk about what this means. We have 6 clusters, and we're varying rolling speed, rolling width, and rolling time between consecutive passes, and we're plotting how the prediction of the model evolves with these. You'll see that each one has 2 lines. There's a red line and a blue line. The red line is a prediction of the model if you're not under pressure, and the blue line is a prediction of the model if you are under pressure. So across the board, we can see that the red line is higher than the blue line, which somehow means that the model understands that being under pressure is not good, which would be expected. That's true across the board, but it's interesting to look at the specific interplay between the 2 lines. And I'll give you an example from cluster 4. And we noticed last night that we put the wrong centroid there, so sorry about that. But this is actually a cluster that's centered 55 meters from goal, so it's the furthest cluster in our sample from goal. And we can see that as we increase speed, in the case where you're not under pressure, the prediction of the model is actually going down. And as we increase the speed of play, when you are under pressure, the prediction is going up. So the interpretation that I give this is, if you're this far from goal and you are under pressure, increasing speed is going to increase the likelihood that you'll score within the next 5 moves. So it could be something like, maybe you're pulling the defenders out of position, or you're creating space in behind, something like that. Whilst if you're not under pressure, then increasing speed maybe isn't doing anything for you, and maybe you're just falling prey to a bit more of inaccuracy. And then ultimately, after 8 meters per second, you see that the speed starts to drop. And we can see that as well in 4 of the clusters, that after 8 meters per second, the speed starts to drop. So there's a lesson of watch your speed beyond this point. Cluster 1 is an interesting one. So cluster 1 is centered 39 meters from goal. It's got a rolling width of 10, so they're playing in a very narrow lane of the pitch. It's got a speed of 6.7. It's the slowest one. It's also the narrowest one. And it's got the least amount of time between consecutive passes. So I think this is represented by, this characterized by being maybe a rondo, like a lot of short interplay in a small space of the pitch. And what's interesting for me from this result is that there are clear optimums in the prediction of the model, around 6 meters per second for speed. And then there's a clear drop-off, and that's only the case when you're not under pressure. In terms of rolling width, there's a clear optimum maybe around 15 meters wide, and there's a clear minimum at 1.5 seconds between consecutive passes, or a little bit before that. So that's the least advisable speed of time between consecutive passes. And finally, in 3 clusters, we can see a tendency for the prediction of the model to go up as we increase width, which is also, let's say, that a general lesson that maybe try to get wide in some of these situations. Okay. Now Danielle is going to talk about the false parts of these moves.
All right. So far we've looked at true events, so what happens while you are probing and right after that default state. But we also want to know what the team does to break that sort of probing state, and what are the outcomes of that. So think of, the first example that we saw on video. There was a string of probing bit, and at some point some vertical pass that tries to do something. So inside possession that have reached the set defense state, we want to look at false events or strings of consecutive false events, to which I'm going to refer to as false blocks, and we want to understand them, and we want to know what's the potential risk and reward of the actions that the team does in there. So in order to understand what those false blocks mean, what we're going to do is cluster them, based first on why they are false, so if it's because of pinballing, lack of height, or too much verticality, but also in terms of intrinsic features that about the blocks, so where they are located, how many players are involved in them, and what's the speed of actions, and so on. And so after we perform that clustering, we can interpret each of those clusters in footballing terms. So the first cluster that we obtain is something that we call hard reset. So the block is characterized by having events with lack of height. Their centroid is less than 30 meters away from their own goal, so they've gone like quite deep, and the speed of action is quite slow. There's less than one event every 2 seconds. There's a milder version of this one, which we call mild reset. So basically, we allow the centroid to be anywhere in your own half of the pitch, and the speed of actions can be a little higher. There's also the pinballing cluster, which contains events tagged as pinballing. We have fast wing play, so the centroid of the cluster is less than 15 meters away from the goal, and the speed of ball circulation is quite high, it's greater than 10 meters per second. And we have the counterpart to that, which is central play, so basically the centroid is not close to a wing, and we split that into central combinative play, so at least 2 players involved, and central individual play, so just 1 player involved. And finally, we have a bunch of other false blocks that represent around 20% of the sample, but we don't give a precise interpretation of those. So for each of these clusters that have an interpretation in footballing terms, we want to understand which is the potential reward of getting into those clusters, which is performing these sort of actions. So in order to look at the reward, we define 2 metrics, goals lived and shots lived. I'm just going to talk about goals lived, the other one is the same. So that's basically the relative increase in your odds of scoring a goal for a possession that contains one of such block. So the first lesson that we learn is that hard reset is a significantly rewarding option because your odds increase by 2, more or less. And the especially interesting about that is that there's a very significant difference between hard reset and mild reset. So in terms of reward, if you are going to reset your play, do it properly, right? There's another interesting lesson that we learned is a comparison between central play and wing play. I just noticed that I wanted to highlight the combinative play row, but it doesn't really matter because what I'm going to say, it holds also for individual play. So, you know, central, there's always the dilemma in football that if you should play by the middle or play by the wings. We see that in general, playing by the middle is more rewarding, but we need also to look at risk to make a decision, right? So in terms of risk, so what happens after you leave the probing state in terms of the danger that you could be handling, there's like three dimensions of risk. You could immediately be worried about losing the ball, but depending on where you lose it and what's your shape at the moment of losing, your odds of conceding a goal or conceding a shot might be higher or lower. So we want to analyze all 3 of them. So basically, we compute the probability for you to lose the ball for a possession that reaches each of those cluster types. And also, if you have lost the ball, what's your probability of conceding a shot or a goal in the next possession? So the first main takeaway is that playing by the middle is the most risky option. And in comparison with wing play, there's a clear trade-off. We saw it was more rewarding, but it's also more risky. So we have not been able to solve this trade-off with our study, but the model that we are doing catches that. But there's, on the other hand, a very clear interpretation for the reset, because hard reset we saw just a minute ago that is more rewarding than mild reset, but it's less risky. So it's a no-brainer. If you are resetting play, do it properly. All right? So I'm going to jump on to conclusions. The first one that we found almost at the moment of starting the study is that defining a set defense from event data is a difficult task, but we are happy that we have put together a framework from which we can get interesting signal. this is part of the football lore, but it's good that we are able to reflect that from the data with our framework. Violence or cutbacks are good when you are playing against asset defense. And while analyzing that complicated black box model that we built, we found that playing wide or around a sweet spot of speed is interesting when you are playing against asset defense. And this is a concrete takeaway that we take from that, but a general takeaway from that is that we shouldn't be afraid to try to interpret the results of these black box type models. We can extract interesting conclusions such as these ones, which can be known, but there might be more in there. In terms of the cluster analysis of false blocks, there's a very clear decision in there. If you are resetting play, do it properly. So take the ball back to your goalkeeper, let the first pressure line go up so that it leaves space. And finally, the classical risk-reward trade-off between central and wing play, that we believe that with a more complicated framework that enables us to define comparable risk and reward metrics, we could try some sort of game theory approach to define strategies. So I guess that's all that we wanted to say. So thanks a lot for your attention, and we'll be happy to take questions.